Imagine this. The scream just dies in her throat. Rough hands grab her, dragging her out of these burning ruins. She's maybe 14 years old, a merchant's daughter from Kiev.
Just hours before.
Yeah, hours ago, she's thinking about tomorrow's chores, right? Now it's just smoke choking the air. Her father's blood is on the frozen ground. And these men, strangers, with eyes like the northern sky, are tying her wrists with horsehair rope.
Tough rope.
Tough rope. And behind her, Kiev, the city she grew up in, is just crumbling. It's becoming ash. This is 1240. The city's gone. The Mongol Empire has arrived.
Yeah, and that scene, I mean, it's incredibly visceral, but it's important, you know? It shows this crucial moment. What's happening to her, it's not just a random act of war. It's actually the first step in a very structured, almost bureaucratic process.
Right.
When we look at the records, we really have to get past that image, the romantic one of the, the noble savage on horseback. It wasn't like that.
Oh, absolutely not. That romantic idea just completely evaporates when you start looking at the actual mechanics of the empire. The sources we've looked at suggest the Mongol Empire wasn't just, the biggest contiguous land empire ever.
Which it was.
Which it was, yeah. But it was also, and this is chilling, arguably the most efficient processor of human misery ever devised.
Exactly. The sheer scale of conquest, you can't deny it. But it's the system underneath. That's what we really need to focus on. It was like this huge decentralized machine built for consumption.
So that's our mission today, really, to unpack that reality. We're trying to go beyond just the fact of conquest and look at the systematic harvesting of human lives. This cold, clinical sorting of conquered people down to, useful specimens.
Yeah.
We want to examine how the Mongols turned atrocity into a kind of science, and specifically focusing on captured women who were treated like valuable commodities, transferable assets. Our sources call them valuable laboratory specimens in this massive social experiment.
And this deep dive, it forces us to face a really harsh truth, doesn't it? That the prosperity, the stability, the Pax Mongolica we sometimes hear about, it was built on a foundation of incredibly calculated industrial-scale cruelty.
Okay, let's get right into the core philosophy, because it's so different from, traditional warfare at the time. Genghis Khan, or Temujin, back then, he understood something really fundamental that others missed. Terror wasn't just a side effect of war.
No.
It was the central point. It was his most effective weapon. Weaponized fear.
It absolutely was. And that's where the strategic genius lies, if you can call it that. This terror, it wasn't random rage like you might expect.
Yeah.
The sources we have show this suffering was carefully calibrated and precisely applied. It turned cruelty into an organizational science. The whole point was to break the will of the next city, the one they hadn't even reached yet, make them surrender before a single arrow flew.
So if we want to see this idea, this philosophy, laid out as actual policy, we need to go back. Right back to the beginning, before he was even Genghis Khan. He's still Temujin. And he defeats the Tatars in 1202.
And this one was personal.
Deeply personal, right?
Right.
The Tatars had poisoned his father. So you'd expect maybe just a bloodbath driven by pure revenge.
But what happened was colder, much more chilling than just revenge. It was really the birth of their state policy for dealing with conquered peoples. After that victory, Temujin gives this infamous order, really chilling. Execute every single Tatar male taller than a cart's linchpin.
The cart's linchpin. That sounds, I don't know, almost random. Why that specific little piece of a wagon?
It seems random, but it was anything but. It was a demonstration of almost mathematical precision applied to managing a population. That linchpin, it was basically a stand-in for the height of a boy around, say, 12 or 13. So, males taller than that, they represented an immediate threat. They had memories of their old tribe, they were strong enough to fight back eventually, and they definitely hold on to that resentment, that desire for rebellion down the line.
So getting rid of them was just pragmatic social engineering.
Exactly. Necessary social engineering from his perspective. They had to be eliminated.
So the older males, the ones who remembered and could fight, they're removed. What about the smaller boys then? The ones below the linchpin height?
They were seen as assets. Boys that young, their original identity could be, scrubbed away much more easily. They could be molded into loyal Mongol warriors, loyal servants.
Too young to really remember the details, the horror.
Pretty much. They'd grow up only knowing the Mongol way, the Mongol system, and that distinction threat versus moldable asset that was the crucial innovation there.
Okay, so that's the policy for males. What was the order for the women and the younger children?
They weren't executed. They were distributed, handed out among his warriors, their families. as slaves, as concubines,
Because they were too valuable.
simply too valuable to waste. From the Mongol viewpoint, they were resources, especially the women. They represented a kind of trifecta of usefulness: immediate labor, long-term breeding potential, and easily transferable sexual property.
Just the sheer pragmatism that hits you. It wasn't about just winning the fight. It was about completely transforming the conquered people into a stable, usable asset base for the empire.
Absolutely. And this method, this calculated sorting, killing the threats, molding the young, and systematically harvesting the women's labor and reproductive capacity, this became the blueprint, the non-negotiable template for all Mongol expansion after that, right across Eurasia, from Korea all the way to Hungary.
Every future conquest was just the Tatar campaign again, but bigger.
Exactly, just scaled up.
So once they had that template, the Mongols didn't just conquer cities, they processed them. When a big city fell, Bukhara, Samarkand, later Baghdad, the aftermath wasn't some wild, chaotic party.
No, not at all.
The sources consistently describe the Mongols working with this disciplined, methodical efficiency. Like butchers in an abattoir is a phrase that comes up.
That phrase, it comes directly from chroniclers who actually watched it happen. And the scale demanded that kind of clinical efficiency. Think about it, a major city might have 50, maybe 100,000 people still alive inside.
You can't just let them wander off.
Exactly. You can't leave them to regroup or rebel. So step one was control. Herd the entire surviving population out into open fields outside the city walls, like setting up these vast sorting pens.
And then the sorting starts, treating people, as you said, like livestock. What were the first cuts in that triage?
It was immediate and brutal, based purely on utility. The very old, anyone obviously sick, anyone too frail or injured to march or work hard, killed right away.
Just resource drains.
Exactly, not assets. Then they separated the children.
Okay, focusing on the male children, how were they evaluated?
The boys were pulled away from their mothers and assessed pretty quickly. If they looked strong or were the right age, maybe young enough to be molded, they might be spared for military service or some kind of domestic training later on.
But most of them.
But the vast majority of boys, especially any who were past that linchpin age but somehow missed the initial execution of the adult men, they were just seen as expendable, future trouble. So they were often killed then and there, joining the adult men in the mass graves.
So if the men were mostly eliminated or molded, it sounds like the women became the focus of the real calculation, as the sources put it.
Yeah.
How did the commanders sort the female captives?
Oh, that assessment was meticulous. Women were sorted by age, by their looks, by any skills they might have, their potential social use. Young girls, especially around puberty, they were extremely valuable commodities for distribution, for breeding. Mature women, if they had, say, calloused hands indicating they were used to hard work, they were marked for labor grinding grain, setting up yurts, serving the camps. And status mattered too. A noble woman might be kept aside as a concubine for a general, or even for the Khan's own household.
Whereas a peasant woman.
Distributed to a common soldier. It was pure resource optimization. Every person assessed for their maximum potential value to the system.
You mentioned a detail earlier, something just horrific about how calculated this was, especially regarding pregnant women. Can we go back to that? Because it says so much about the sheer ruthless pragmatism.
Yes, it's probably the most disturbing proof of their clinical approach. Sources describe again and again pregnant women having their unborn children literally cut out of their wombs.
And this wasn't just random cruelty.
Well, the cruelty is undeniable, of course, but the logic behind it, according to the analysis, was cold, practical logistics. A pregnant slave is a liability, right? She can't march as fast, she needs more resources.
The child.
And the child, if born, might grow up remembering where they came from, holding on to a non-Mongol identity. So by eliminating the fetus, they stabilized the immediate asset, the mother, and they neutralized a potential long-term problem, both logistical and cultural. It was the ultimate risk removal.
So once the women were sorted, they basically became inventory. Inventory in what you call the continental enterprise of trafficking. That implies this massive coordinated operation across the whole empire.
That's exactly what it was. The Mongol Empire essentially functioned as the biggest slave market in history up to that point. It turned human trafficking into a continent-spanning business centuries before, the Atlantic slave trade. These captives flowed along the very same trade routes, the Silk Roads, that carried silk, spices, information.
Just think about the scale of that. You mentioned Baghdad, 1258. Chroniclers estimate anywhere from 200,000 to maybe 800,000 civilians killed in just a week. But even during that slaughter,
Even during the massacre, the systematic extraction of human capital was ongoing. While men were being executed, thousands, mostly young women and children, were being loaded onto huge wagon trains.
Wow.
Persian scribes, often captives themselves, were forced to actually catalog this human cargo before the wagons rolled out, sent off to markets thousands of miles away.
And the destinations were specific.
Very specific. The big slave markets in places like Samarkand, the more luxurious pleasure houses and administrative centers in the capital, Karakorum, or they'd be sent to remote military outposts where the Mongol garrisons needed domestic help and, well, sexual companions. It was a whole logistic system built on forced marches.
And that journey itself, moving these human assets, it wasn't just hard. It was designed to be a form of torture, wasn't it?
Yeah.
To break the survivor's will.
That's a critical part of it, yes. The captives were roped together, sometimes neck to neck, forced to walk hundreds, maybe thousands of miles across deserts, mountains, minimal food, minimal water.
But they had infrastructure for this.
They did. Surprisingly sophisticated. Sources talk about established rest stops along the major routes, stocked with supplies, replacement guards, even some basic medical care to keep the most valuable cargo alive.
But if you couldn't keep up...
Ruthless efficiency again.
Yeah.
If you got sick, injured, or just too exhausted, there was no mercy. You were abandoned by the side of the road or killed on the spot. Anything to avoid slowing down the convoy or wasting resources.
So the journey itself was the final filter.
Exactly. It was the final stage of breaking them,
Yes.
turning them from people into just walking, obedient property by the time they reached their destination.
And for the most valuable captives, the final destination was often the capital, Karakorum, which became this living display of the empire's reach. You called it multiculturalism at its most grotesque.
That's a stark way to put it, but yeah, Karakorum was the central showcase for this human collection. You'd literally see blonde Russian girls serving tables next to dark-skinned Arab women, next to incredibly skilled Chinese artisans, Central Asian peasants, all enslaved, all part of the machinery.
And the Khan's own household was the pinnacle of this.
Absolutely. The Great Khan's personal household was the ultimate symbol of this power. Genghis Khan, and his successors too, they deliberately collected wives and concubines like trophies, each woman representing a conquered people or maybe a powerful alliance sealed in flesh.
These weren't just random rewards for the conquerors, though, were they? The sources point towards something much more deliberate long-term. A strategy we could maybe call genetic empire building.
Oh, it absolutely was strategic. The Mongol system of marriage and concubinage, and it wasn't just about politics or, heaven forbid, affection. It was fundamentally rooted in systematically breeding a kind of hybrid master race, one that could inherit and effectively rule these vast, diverse territories they'd conquered.
And the sheer number of women involved.
The sheer volume of women brought into Mongol households, whether they wanted to be there or not, created this incredible biological legacy.
And we actually have modern proof of that legacy, right?
We do, yeah. Modern genetic studies, looking specifically at Y chromosome markers passed down the male line, they suggest something pretty staggering, disturbing, really. About 1 in every 200 men alive today, right across Asia and into the Middle East, carries the genetic markers traced back to Genghis Khan's lineage.
Wow. 1 in 200.
It's a monumental biological footprint. And it was undeniably written in the bodies of countless conquered women forced to bear the children of their captors.
So this wasn't just random violence or, soldiers grabbing spoils after a battle. The sources make it really clear. Institutionalizing sexual slavery was a core part of the state structure itself.
It was absolutely organized policy, managed with the same kind of bureaucratic thoroughness they used for organizing armies or collecting taxes. The distribution of women was strictly based on rank and merit.
So higher rank, better choice.
Pretty much. High-ranking officers, top administrators, they got the most prized captives. Common soldiers received women designated more for labor or just basic breeding. And the Mongol bureaucracy kept meticulous records of all this.
They tracked them.
They tracked this human cargo. Documented transfers, noted distributions, treated women with the same precision they applied to tracking shipments of grain or herds of horses.
And sexual slavery even became a form of currency among the soldiers.
Exactly. Which is maybe the ultimate act of dehumanization, isn't it? Warriors would literally trade women like poker chips, gamble them away in dice games, use them to pay off debts they'd run up.
So a woman could change hands multiple times.
Oh, dozens of times. A particularly desirable young captive might pass through many hands in just a single year. It shows just how completely they were seen as fungible property within that military culture. And the incredibly high death rates for women right after capture and during transport tell you just how brutal this whole system was.
Moving from the physical brutality to the psychological,
Yeah.
the Mongols were also experts in what we now call cultural genocide, right? They knew breaking a woman's spirit was maybe even more important for control than just breaking her body.
They were masters of psychological warfare, really sophisticated and shattering techniques. They developed specific ways to humiliate and degrade people, designed to just crush any resistance, destroy any hope of ever going back to their old lives.
Like what? What kind of techniques?
Well, sources record women being forced to watch their husbands being tortured and executed or seeing their children murdered before they themselves were claimed as property.
Oh, God.
It deliberately severed that psychological connection to their past life, made their new reality as Mongol property the only thing left.
And the end goal was total cultural annihilation.
Precisely. Captives were strictly forbidden to speak their native languages, or practice their religions, or even keep connections with people from their own homeland if they encountered them.
They even took their names.
Names were systematically changed, or often just erased entirely. You know, a noblewoman from Poland might just become the foreign woman in the third tent. A skilled weaver from China becomes the Chinese girl who does the patterns. By stripping away identity, language, connection, they created this cultural vacuum.
A vacuum that could only be filled by submitting to the Mongol system.
Exactly. Submission was the only option left.
So the long-term result of all this systematic breeding and violation was this growing population of mixed-blood children, kids born from these forced unions. And they lived in this really strange, conflicted space, didn't they? Not quite Mongol, not quite slave.
Yeah, their existence was deliberately confusing, you could say. The Mongols figured out pretty quickly how useful these mixed-blood children could be. They were actively cultivated to become administrators, interpreters, kind of go-betweens.
Why them specifically?
Because they were genetically linked to the conquerors, but they grew up often in the conquered lands, understanding the local culture. So they could never fully belong to either side. Their primary loyalty, therefore, had to be to the Mongol administration that oversaw everything.
One source called them a walking monument to violation.
It's a poignant phrase, isn't it? Visible proof of the empire's success in subjugating peoples, right down to the genetic level.
And managing this constant flow of people across these huge distances required infrastructure. Major crossroads captured cities. They became these highly efficient, well, dehumanization facilities, processing centers.
Think of them as massive human logistics hubs, yeah. When new groups of captives arrived after those brutal marches, they went through immediate, intense processing. Stripped naked, bathed, partly hygiene, partly humiliation, and then examined closely for disease or defects.
Sorting them for different uses.
Exactly. Sorting and assigning the assets. If you looked strong enough for hard labor, you might be branded, like cattle, for easy identification and sent to a work gang. If you were selected for sexual service, it was a different path, cleaned up, maybe dressed in Mongol clothes, and then often trained in how to please their new owners.
And the elderly or sick who somehow survived the march.
This was often the end of the line for them. If they weren't useful, they were eliminated here.
But the truly, insidious part wasn't just processing people like objects. It was turning the victims themselves into accomplices in the system.
That's maybe the ultimate refinement, the most chilling part. It became self-perpetuating. Captured women who showed they were intelligent or maybe just compliant enough, they were forced to help process the next wave of arrivals.
No, what would they do?
They'd act as translators during interrogations. They'd help sort the new groups based on instructions. Sometimes they were pressured to inform on escape plans or point out potential troublemakers among their own people.
Creating division among the captives themselves.
Exactly. And some became so broken, so desperate for any small favor or better treatment, that they'd actually compete for their master's approval by actively participating in the abuse of the newer captives. It created this horrifyingly efficient cycle of oppression that needed surprisingly little direct oversight from the Mongols themselves.
Wow. And this level of systematic control, it needs a legal basis, right? We're talking about a legal framework of dehumanization.
Correct. Mongol law, especially the code known as the Yasa, went to great lengths to actually codify how non-Mongols were treated. This wasn't just, cultural bias. It was systematic legal conditioning.
How did it work?
Non-Mongols were explicitly placed on a legal hierarchy that ranked them much closer to animals than to full human beings in the eyes of the law. The legal system recognized different categories of human property, each with specific rules about who could own them, how they could be transferred, what punishments applied.
And most captured women fell into the absolute lowest category.
Yes. The lowest level of human chattel, which included most captured women, was classified explicitly in the bureaucratic records we have as livestock.
Livestock.
Livestock, subject to the exact same laws that govern trading, inheriting, or using horses or cattle. This was incredibly sophisticated legal thinking, but dedicated entirely to exploitation on a massive scale. And it required a huge bureaucracy to manage it. All registries, quality checks, transfer documents, tracking these human assets right across the empire.
And all this bureaucracy, this legal framework, it all supported what was basically a giant long-term genetic engineering project, that strategic breeding program you mentioned.
The long game the Mongols were playing was kind of astounding. They didn't just use captured women for, immediate needs. They saw them as vital parts of a multi-generational strategy to solidify their role.
So the sorting wasn't just about immediate use, but future generations too.
Absolutely. The selection process directly influenced future outcomes. Women who were seen as exceptionally beautiful or intelligent or maybe came from noble backgrounds, they were often reserved for breeding with the top Mongols, the Khans, the generals, the powerful administrators.
And their children.
The children from those unions were basically destined for positions of power, creating this inherited ruling class blended with local populations but loyal to the center.
While the other women were paired with common soldiers.
Exactly. The women deemed less attractive or those mainly valued for labor, they were bred with ordinary soldiers. The idea there was to produce the next generation of reliable foot soldiers, workers, people who were culturally flexible but fundamentally part of the Mongol system.
So the ultimate goal was this hybrid population.
Right. Genetically tied to the Mongols, but diverse enough culturally to act as the administrators, the interpreters, the sort of connective tissue needed to hold together this vast conquered empire for the long haul.
So when the Mongol armies finally swept into Europe, places like Poland, Hungary, in 1241, they brought this whole industrial-scale human trafficking system with them. And it hit Western Europe like a ton of bricks, didn't it? It was the first time they'd seen anything like it.
This shock was absolutely profound. You read the early European chroniclers, and they just couldn't grasp the systematic nature of it all, the sheer scale of the killing and the capturing. The terror was overwhelming.
There were reports of mass suicides.
Yes, sources mention communities choosing mass suicide right outside their city walls, deciding that immediate death was better than facing capture and being sucked into this Mongol system. The Mongols deliberately weaponized that fear. The threat of enslavement, of cultural destruction, it paralyzed resistance across huge parts of Eastern Europe. It created one of the first really large-scale refugee crises in European history.
And that system, that machinery of terror and organization, it was so deeply embedded that even when the unified Mongol Empire started to break apart in the 13th, 14th centuries, the millions of enslaved people weren't suddenly freed, were they?
No, not at all. The system just fractured, but it kept running. The successor states, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Yuan dynasty in China, they inherited these oppressive structures and kept them going.
So the slave trade continued.
Oh, yes. The Golden Horde kept dominating the human trade along the Volga and Black Sea. The Ilkhanate maintained its sophisticated slave markets in Persia. The Yuan emperors kept their huge numbers of foreign concubines and slaves working in administration. That machinery of oppression, it was so deeply rooted, so profitable, it basically outlived the central empire that created it.
And the true scale of this crime against humanity, we're now able to quantify it better through both science and historical records. The evidence is genetic and administrative.
It is. On the genetic side, we can trace the mitochondrial DNA. That's a genetic line passed only through women right across continents today. It's like a molecular shadow showing the paths of countless women dragged from their homes, forced to bear children far away. It confirms the sheer volume of forced migration and interbreeding.
And the paperwork backs it up.
The administrative records are just chillingly efficient. Surviving registers that list slave distributions, they often read exactly like inventories for livestock, cataloging people by age, health, their assessed value, tracking transfers between different owners or military units with this cold, bureaucratic precision. This isn't just stories of cruelty, it's hard evidence of a highly organized, state-run economic system built on human suffering.
And that terrifying efficiency, that whole organizational model, it sadly created a kind of playbook, didn't it? One that got picked up, refined, and repeated by other totalitarian regimes later in history.
Unfortunately, yes, the techniques the Mongols pioneered, that systematic dehumanization, the industrial-scale processing of captives, using administrative policy to manage human assets, and crucially, using terror not just randomly, but as a calculated, self-sustaining tool of government. You see echoes of it later on.
Where specifically?
Well, you can see parallels in Stalin's mass deportations of entire peoples, in the structured, factory-like extermination systems of Hitler's concentration camps, even in Pol Pot's attempts to completely erase culture and history in Cambodia. The real Mongol innovation, perhaps, was creating this comprehensive mechanism that actually turned victims into participants in their own oppression, which made the whole thing incredibly efficient and reduced the need for constant direct enforcement by the state.
Which brings us right back to that final, really disturbing paradox of the Mongol legacy.
Yeah, the system of cruelty wasn't just incidental to their success. It was arguably the essential foundation for their biggest achievements. You know, connecting East and West, creating that huge land empire, establishing that first truly global economy across 13 time zones.
You can't separate those achievements from the atrocities.
You really can't. They seem intrinsically linked. Those logistical and administrative successes were built on the efficient processing, distribution, and exploitation of human capital. Hashtagged outro.
So we started this deep dive thinking about that one 14-year-old girl in Kiev, wrists bound with horsehair rope. And what we've really unpacked is that her personal tragedy wasn't some random act of violence. It was her initiation into the most organized, most efficient, most sprawling human processing system the world had ever seen up to that point. A system that looked at human life only through the cold lens of utility.
And the Mongol legacy, it really forces us into this difficult place with history, doesn't it? They were, at the same time, the architects of the world's biggest land empire and the operators of history's most successful, large-scale human trafficking network. The dark lesson here, the takeaway maybe, is that systematic dehumanization, if you organize it well enough, with enough administrative skill and ruthless political will, it can actually be the foundation for lasting power and huge imperial success.
It's unsettling. Some Mongol chroniclers apparently suggested that how we judge them as visionary conquerors who united the world, or as systematic criminals whose innovations and cruelty echoed for centuries, that choice was ultimately ours, meaning future generations.
Yeah.
So, thinking about that, given the depth of the administrative efficiency we've discussed, the cold legal system that literally classified people as livestock, the genetic legacy still present today.
Yeah.
What is our responsibility as historians, as societies, when we talk about or commemorate the success of an empire built on such a brutally efficient foundation?
It's a heavy question.
It really is. Something profound to consider as you reflect on this deep dive into the true human operational costs of the Mongol Age.